Hello and welcome to Basin Safety Monthly Safety Trainings. This is your safety instructor, Jonathan Greiner. This month we're going to be covering forklift safety, aerial lift or man lift safety, and basic rigging safety. None of these courses are certifications. You can do the hands-on evaluations for these trainings based on this training, but you will not be getting a card for it. So with that, let's get this safety started. Alright, so first off, we're going to be covering forklift safety, which is covered in 29 OSHA CFR 1910-178 and 1926-453. Aerial lifts will be ANSI A92.2, 2018, and for rigging safety, it'll be CFR, again, 29, 1910.179 and 1926.251 and 271. Yes, that's a lot of boring numbers. I just want to let you know which areas that we're covering. So if you want to, you can Google any of those numbers and it'll bring up the full list of regulations, which are candidly, the constituent parts that make up the training. We just try to make it a little bit more exciting than just reading the OSHA manual or ANSI manual in this case. So I'm not going to put any of that on a quiz. You're not going to have to remember it, but just so you know the different areas that those topics cover. So the objectives for today's training, I'm going to kind of put all those into one slide here just so we know what we're covering. And they're pretty much the same for all the different areas. That's why I like to put these trainings together so we're not, bouncing all over the place, but we're keeping it very straightforward. So for forklifts, they're also called industrial powered trucks or powered industrial trucks. So there are some requirements for that. We're going to cover those as well as safe operations. For aerial lift, also called man lift, we're going to cover safe requirements for that, as well as implement safe operations of man lifts, and then basic rigging safety. We're going to talk about with rigging, you're not operating equipment, you're essentially supporting the operation of heavy equipment, typically cranes or some form of lifting device, but we're going to talk about the requirements for that, as well as safe rigging operations. So starting with forklifts, again, this is 1910.178. We're going to talk about the safe operations, how to, inspect them properly, drive them properly, and then also use them properly with different stickers and different things that need to be on the equipment, what the inspection procedures need to cover, etc. So there are a lot of different types of industrial trucks. Typically they're considered, we call them designations, we call them classes. I'm going to keep it very simple though, mostly because in our world, in oil and gas and energy, we typically use one or two different types of forklifts. We're also going to talk about the safeguards of different forklifts and powered industrial trucks, and essentially knowing that you must select the proper type of equipment. Now, I will say this again, that in our world, typically our companies buy us a forklift and we use that forklift. There's not like 15, or in this case, 11 different types of forklifts out there, and we pick the one that's best for our use case. It's usually, hey, this is the forklift I'm going to use to do this. And a lot of the different classifications for forklifts, just to keep this basic and quick, has to do with the atmosphere or the environment you're working in. So if you're working in an explosive atmosphere where you have LEL floating around or dust floating around that could ignite, you don't want to use something with a high heat output like a diesel forklift, right? You're going to probably want to use an electric forklift that has some of the, class 1, div 1 or div 2 encasements for the battery and the engine and all those different parts. So that's really what it comes down to. And then also weight requirements. If you're using a 3,500 pound forklift for 5,000 pound lift, then we're probably going to have an issue. So outside of weight, weight restrictions and lifting restrictions, the different types of forklifts are classified by combustion type and then fuel, as well as the subclasses in each of those classes. So again, we have this is a DS forklift there on the right. There's also additional types of diesel forklifts. We have diesel, we have electric, as I mentioned, we have gas and liquid petroleum forklifts, and then lastly rough terrain forklifts such as a telehandler. And each of those has different inspection requirements. Again, if you're looking under the hood of a diesel forklift, you're going to see different things than an electric one, and you're going to have to inspect different components. A lot more wiring on the electric ones for just a basic example. So, and again, the weight is another thing you got to look for. How heavy is the equipment or the material that I'm lifting, and does the forklift that I'm using meet that requirement? So it's important to make sure you have the right one. 1910.178 again does have, a very clear list of why you would select a different type of forklift for different type of equipment. So another thing about it is the labels on each of these vehicles does need to be clear, right? If like you need to be able to see the serial number, and they get scratched off, they get beat up if they're outside. The sun kind of wreaks havoc on these labels, so you can call the manufacturer or the rental company if you're renting it and get a new one put on there by typically the forklift guy, the person that comes out and does the annual inspections, but they do need to have those on the forklift. So this is true for man lifts and forklifts and cranes. Anything you're using, you cannot install homemade devices on these things without manufacturer's approval. So what some people do, and this photo is a great example of this, is this forklift is not designed to lift the load that it is lifting. So the operator or owner said, you know what, if we put some counterweight on this thing, we got this handy little hook, we can hook this around, in this case, the propane. We can hook this around the propane support and, add this weight to it, and that will keep the back wheels from lifting up when we attempt to lift our load. That's a no-no. So again, it's got to be a manufacturer approved. And if you do get manufacturer approval, good on you. Great job. You do. Then the labels and decals and all that will need to be updated in that instance. Going to cover this really quick for the atmospheric requirements. Again, different types of atmospheric gases or dusts in the air will change the type of forklift you can use. And it's not just forklifts or aerial lifts or really anything. It's tools, equipment, etc. Distances from all these things start to matter. But, acetylene, butadiene ethyl oxide, hydrogen, propylene oxide, acetaldehyde, cyclopropane, ethyl ether, ethylene, unsymmetrical dimethyl hydrazine, just to name a few. Just a lot. Hydrogen sulfide, right? Anything that's potentially flammable, you need to make sure you have the right forklift for, or industrial truck. All right, stability with forklifts is pretty important. Same thing with aerial lifts as well. You'll see a similarity. Longitudinal stability is the truck's resistance turning forward or backward, end over end. Lateral stability is over on its side, so to left or right. So again, longitudinal, front, back, lateral, left and right. You can also say front to back and left to right. I would be fine with that, but at least now you know the technical term. So as the center of gravity, as you have a load on the equipment and you lift it up, that center of gravity will change. It will rise with your load. And so when you're traveling, especially because the center of gravity has changed from the base of that equipment, which is where it is when the load or the forks are completely down at the ground, as you lift that load up and start to move, or even as you're holding the load, the center of gravity will change. It will change with the position of that load. When you go to move, that is considered your dynamic stability. So your dynamic stability, again, along with the lateral and the longitudinal stability, all come into play. So as you're moving the load, your center of gravity is going to shift with your inertia. And as you make quick turns or maneuver, it's going to shift. And if the load's center of gravity shifts against your vehicle center of gravity and is overcome, it'll tip over. People do die in forklifts every year. Typically, they're not. First of all, they don't have their seatbelt buckled, so they fall out of it, and then the forklift falls on top of them. And if you have, connection to any like OSHA violation Instagrams or LinkedIn accounts, or even just watch YouTube, you've seen videos where these sorts of things happen. So it does happen. So just make sure, what I like to say with forklifts and aerial lifts is if you are traveling in them, keep everything low and slow. Just pretend you're low riding down the street, downtown Detroit or something, showing off your new whip, just drive low and slow. Maybe don't do that downtown Detroit. Just maybe not. Equipment components for a forklift, pretty straightforward. We have you have the forks starting there. Then you have the mast, which supports the forks. The tilt cylinder, again, that can that allows it to tilt forward and backward. You have your lift cylinder up and down. You have an overhead guard, also called a rollover protection device. But in a forklift, it isn't so much about rolling over as it is if things were to fall, that would protect them from hitting you. You have your horn, which needs to work, seatbelt that needs to work, and auxiliary seat brake. So these are, obviously the most important components of the forklift. If any of these things aren't working, we're going to have a pretty serious issue on that equipment. So as I mentioned, overwhelming the forklift with too much weight can cause problems. Not accounting for the center of gravity can cause problems. So you want to make sure you're keeping it low and slow again. And here I have this genius but dangerous situation here. You've probably seen this photo around. I wonder if this isn't photoshopped. I mean, candidly, it's got the feel of a Photoshop. I don't know why these guys are floating in the air. But either way, no, we cannot use one heavy duty forklift to lift up the baby forklift to lift up the thing so we can go high enough. We just need a forklift with a larger lift cylinder ultimately. All right, equipment inspection, vital. This needs to be done every day prior to the shift. If you have 2 shifts, you can get away with doing one for the day, but my recommendation is you just do one per shift, period. Now, if you have multiple people operating that equipment during said shift, one inspection will do. Each person doesn't need to do their own inspection. That's just kind of doubling up on work. So your equipment checklist, it's going to cover, again, the horn. Does the horn work? Does the cylinder work? Does the tilt cylinder work? Does the backup alarm work, etc. All that's on here, as well as, condition of the equipment. If something's failing or something's not working, you need to get that to the appropriate maintenance department or rental company right away so that they can come fix it. And some things like, hey, the seatbelt clicker, it's not easy to get in there, but I can get it in there. That's not shut the forklift down, send it back right away, right? As long as it clicks in and it's working, it's fine, but still notate it. Now, if the hydraulics are leaking and you can't lift anything, don't keep going with the forklift. So there's going to be, a little bit of operator decision-making involved in this as far as how serious a condition or a problem is. So another big thing about forklifts, this is where other people die, not necessarily operating the forklift, but around the forklift, is they are just not paying attention. And if you use a forklift, especially inside of a warehouse, you'll note this. We see forklifts so much. It's just, a part of business that when someone's operating it, you're not even paying attention to it, right? It's like the trash can in the corner. It's there, but you're not thinking about it as you're going about your day. Well, that can be deadly if you're behind an area where things are being loaded or offloaded, if you're not paying attention around a corner and there's a forklift being operated. Yes, the equipment operator, it's his responsibility to kind of know where everyone is. I will agree with that, but I'll also say that if you're around a forklift and not operating it, give it some berth, pay attention, give a shout if you're coming around a corner and you know that the guy operating the forklift's on the other side, etc. A few other tips and tricks here. We don't want to, drive right up close to people that are walking around. We want to give them some space as well. Don't pass below elevated loads. Anything that's lifted in the air, you want to be far, far away from that. Use a spotter when necessary. You can also change, a lot of people will say, well, when I'm lifting, equipment up, I can't see because it's in my way. It's like, well, then drive it backwards where you can see, right? Be a little creative there. It's not the best way, but if you can't see, it's better to operate backwards and be able to see. Passengers cannot have people on the edge of the forklift. Some forklifts have a second seat. Most of them do not. If it does, you can have someone. If it doesn't, you can't. And then you want to always make sure that your arms and legs are inside of the forklift. Again, in case it tips over, you don't want it to be crushed between the mast or the carrying cage and your arm. That would be bad. So entry and exit, we always want to make sure we're facing it, having 3 points of contact, never jump down from the forklift. If it does tip over, you want to get real small, hold on to that wheel or whatever control device you have, kind of put your elbows into your ribs there and get real small so when it tips over, you stay inside of it. That is where a lot of fatalities happen, is that people, again, aren't belted, fall outside, and are crushed by the forklift. These are not light pieces of equipment. They have some weight to them, and they're very unforgiving. So if you're riding one that stands up, then you can just, jump off as it's tipping over. Again, the best option here is don't put yourself in a situation where your equipment's going to tip over. Drive low and slow, low and slow. So leaving vehicles unattended, it is not best practice to leave the thing on when you're operating it. If you have to get off and go check something, open an overhead door, something like that, just turn it off. Lower everything down. Shut her down, and then come back to it and turn it on again. So you need to have your controls neutralized, have everything lowered, shut it off, have its brake set, and then if it's on incline, you also want to put a wheel chock on there. So traveling with the vehicle, again, we talked about, your dynamic stability. So the higher you lift that load, the less stable you're going to be. Some of these are not just for powered industrial trucks, but anything. If you're going over railroad tracks, probably shouldn't be doing that with a forklift. But, especially, if you're out there on location and you're nearby a track and you have a telehandler, these rules do apply to you. Obviously, you want to yield the right of way for emergency vehicles, maintain 3 lengths from the vehicle ahead. And another thing that I try to kind of put into people's minds when operating these is you want to look at things with 3 colors: green, yellow, red. So red is anything closest to that forklift. Yellow is anything within 1 to 2 lengths, and then green is anything 3 lengths or more away from it. Meaning that people, equipment, materials, corners, you want to round out. You want to keep that distance from everything around you, just so that you're not, people aren't in your way and you're not in other people's way. When loading a forklift, you want to make sure that you're as stable as possible. You don't want one wheel lifted off the ground on an incline, attempting to engage a load. You want to make sure that the load is below the rated capacity of the vehicle, and then trucks with attachments are essentially considered partially loaded. So if you do have an attachment on there, that you have to count that weight towards your total weight. Maintenance is a required thing. In forklifts, just like anything with hydraulic systems, they do need inspections, maintenance, and there are certain hour numbers where certain things need to happen. The instruction manual is going to tell you that, and that's why it always has to be on the vehicle at all times. So if it's not in safe operation, shut it down, lock it out. Making repairs, you have to be a qualified person to make repairs. Even if you've been fixing lawnmowers in your backyard for 10 years and you've got your old Honda pretty much figured out, that does not make you a qualified forklift maintenance person. So fuel and ignition system maintenance obviously must be done in a safe place, not next to the welding shop, for example. And batteries, if there are batteries, or if it's battery powered, that's another kind of no-no area. It needs to be disconnected to work on it. So training, as I mentioned at the beginning of this course, you're not going to get a forklift card from this course. However, this is about 85% of the classroom training, 0% of the hands-on training that you'd need. So if you have taken this course and you want to get your forklift card, you can get in touch with us at Base and Safety, info@baseandsafetyus.com, or training@baseandsafetyus.com, and we can put you through the rest of the course and then evaluate you on our forklift right there at the shop, and you can get your card. So everybody that operates a forklift does need to have a valid, current forklift card. They last for a year. Some companies allow you to go 3 years. I think, it really depends on what your company requires, so I check into that. You got to be 18 years old to have it, and when you're training, you have to be supervised. So that's kind of all the forklift training requirements. So another image here is the forklift stability triangle. Again, the center of gravity is going to be right in the middle of these things, which will change with the height. So you have your counterweight, which is A, your front tires, which are B and C, and right in the middle there is your center of gravity. Again, that's right at the ground level, maybe an inch or two higher with the load down at the ground, and then as you lift that load up, that tends to go higher. So we want to kind of keep that in mind. Are some different types of forklifts. We have electric, diesel, gasoline, and liquid petroleum gas, typically on the ignition and power sources. Longitudinal stability, again, front and back, lateral, side to side. Dynamic stability is when the forklift is operating, when it's moving from place to place. Have to be 18 to drive one, and employees must be trained and evaluated prior to operating them by yourself. You need to have the card, essentially. All right, that wraps up forklift. Again, if you want to get your card, and that goes the same for aerial lift training that we're going to do and rigging training that we're going to do today, this puts you through about 80% of it. You're going to have to come in for the rest of it and then also be evaluated, but then you can get your certified card. So basic aerial lift safety training. And again, I say basic here because you don't get the card but we are going to go through some basics of aerial lifts. So accident prevention is pretty much, number one when it comes to operating an aerial lift. Unlike a forklift, these typically have, unless you're operating a scissor lift, they typically have some form of articulation to them, which again, with your center of gravity, same thing, it's going to move with the weight on the equipment. So we want to make sure that a competent person is inspecting not just the equipment, but also the work site. These things are designed to be level and flat, and a lot of them are used in non-level areas, such as work sites and pads and locations, and even out in the back in the yard. And so we want to make sure that it's good conditions. And when people get hurt on aerial lifts, typically it's because of the work site location. There's issues with it that aren't accounted for. People are trying to get stuff done, and they move forward without thinking through the worst case scenario. So you got to be trained and qualified to operate the equipment. Each person needs to understand what unsafe conditions exist while operating an aerial lift, which we're going to cover today. We want to prohibit unauthorized persons from operating aerial lifts, and then also make sure people stay inside of the lift once they're in the lift, unless they're moving to a platform and they have adequate tie-off. As in this photo, which is not following those rules. There's just a lot of things. I love this photo. I actually found this photo I didn't take this photo. I found this photo on a stock photo. I think I typed in like forklift or aerial lift death possible or potential, and this is what popped up. Essentially, you have a guy, there's a swing gate on these forklifts. A lot of us know that to get in and out. So he's used that swing gate. He's moved it out of the way so that he can step to the ladder. Looks like he's moving a cable there. Maybe doing some welding. Looks like his welding mask is down. It's just you got Billy standing there below him, kind of watching like, yep, this looks good. Homemade ladder. Just a lot of things going wrong here. Rebar below, he's not, don't get me wrong, he's not 100 feet in the air, right? He's probably 8, maybe 7 feet in the air. But if you fall from that height, people die or get seriously hurt falling out of the back of pickup trucks every year, right? They get up there, start moving stuff around, fall out, and literally they don't make it. It does not take a lot of height, even on flat ground, to get hurt. So this situation, just a lot of things can go wrong. He's not tied off. Even if he was tied off, like this would be a bad situation. It would swing you right into those. This might be a bad situation to be tied off to the forklift at this point, or the aerial lift at this point, actually. But ultimately, 100 things going wrong here, and we're going to kind of check those off the list as we go here. I did take this photo. This was us 70 feet in the air on something called a vapor recovery system. Essentially, this knocks out gas from oil, really gassy oil. It starts at the top of the tower, moves its way down, and as it goes down, these downcomers knock the gas out of the oil. So we were up there inspecting it, sent a guy from the top of this thing. He climbed through these little levels all the way down to the bottom inside on a cable to inspect it. That was quite a job. That was the highest I've ever been in a man lift for that period of time, and it was definitely pretty hairy. So, we had to make sure everything was right before we did it. So aerial lifts must have the following markings, just like forklifts: identification, operational information, and instructions. So as far as training requirements go, the only employees who are on it need to be trained. These are 3-year. Some company, again, do require them every year. So this is the theoretical or the classroom portion. Again, the majority of it, you'd have to do a little bit more. But then if something changes, if you have new or different equipment, when you get new or different equipment, you must be reevaluated on that new equipment. So even if it's the difference between a JLG and a Komatsu, for example. I don't even know if Komatsu makes them. I just made that up. But if you change equipment manufacturers, or if it's a 450 versus a 350 or a 650, you would need to be reevaluated on that new piece of equipment to make sure you understand Now, if it's the same make, like a JLG, it's, you're probably going to figure it out pretty fast. But there are some differences. Capabilities, some of them have outriggers, for example. You'll want to make sure that you know all the components before they're like, yep, you're good to go. Get out in the field with that thing. So inspection and maintenance requirements. I'm going to go through this pretty quick, mostly on the frequent side. So frequent is typically a daily check, right? You're going to make sure there's no leaks at the anchorage for the hydraulic system. You're going to make sure that the backup alarm works, or that in a lot of these cases, these have front and back alarms. If it's moving, it's beeping at you. You're going to check the operating controls, make sure they're not jumpy, make sure that they're smoothly working and they actually reach the maximum intended limit. Check fiberglass and other insulating materials, make sure it's not broken. A lot of times they're rain covers more than anything, and you don't want rain on a lot of these things. Check for missing or ineligible operating instructional markings. Electrical systems for malfunction. Heated up wires, smell of burnt wires, wires that are pulling away, for example. We're going to look at bolts, locking devices, or looseness for deformation, cracks in the frame, especially to a certain extent in the welds is typically where we're going to see it first. That gets a little bit more on the in-depth, but still not a bad idea. Not a bad idea to check it. All unsafe items must be replaced. Again, it's like before, right? If the instructional markings in the man basket, right, you have your controls up there, are starting to get a little sun faded, but you can still read them. Something to note, maybe you don't need to shut the whole job down, right? Like, it's a little faded there. We probably need to get a new sticker. You don't maybe need to shut the job down. Hydraulics are leaking, right? And you start to go up and you're bouncing around like crazy. Probably time to shut that thing down and take it back to the yard. So inspection records for these, there's no OSHA requirement to keep them. But not a bad idea to have them, just when you're done. And again, this is every shift before you go to use it. You do your inspection, you make your checklist, and then, you go about your day, but they don't have to be kept. Maintenance requirements, however, especially your annuals, these do need to be kept. They need to be documented on the equipment so that you can see that it has been checked. And some equipment may require more than annual, but at least at minimum annual. And then the people that are doing this have to be able to also fix it. So you can't just be like, oh, I'll do the annual. If you're going to do the annual, you also have to be able to fix the problems that you find, for the most part. Modifications, just like a forklift, you can't be putting man-made stuff on there. It needs to be, just what the manufacturer made. Unless, again, you get their approval. And if you get that, good on you. Very surprised, but then you need to change some things about the lift's identifiers. So operations, kind of moving in for a close here. As I mentioned, you're going to do your inspection, your pre-start inspection. It goes through the list again. Hydraulics, is the alarm working? Does it reach its maximum potential? There's an on-the-ground inspection and on our form. Not all of them have this, but we have an on-the-ground one, and then or off inspection. And then once you turn it on, you have another set of checks that you do. And the other thing about both forklifts, I didn't mention this before, but aerial lifts as well. Super important. A lot of people skip this, I've noticed on the inspection, is air pressure in the tires. Dude, the tires, especially if they're, an inflatable tire, some of them are solid, so it's not an issue. But if you have an inflatable tire and one of them's flat, it is going to, I promise you, it's going to affect how safe you feel in that equipment. It's going to affect how much you can load it, how quickly and easily it moves, how bouncy the ride is. Like, make sure your tires are full. Just my personal soapbox of mine. Check check how full it's supposed to be, and people just don't do it. You'd be surprised. I'll go to a forklift, man. It'd be like it looks almost fine, but then you check it, it's like 30 or 40 or sometimes 50% of required tire pressure. So just keep that in mind. Make sure you get that fixed and reported right away. Do it before every shift. Weather conditions for any equipment outside, especially when you're in a basket many feet in the air, wind and lightning are probably going to be a good reason to shut that down. Usually the manufacturer, operations manual, which just like a forklift needs to be on the equipment at all times, will tell you load operating limits and then also a little bit about weather conditions. How many miles per hour, for example, the wind where it's too windy to be up there. That's something you should know. Definitely no lightning at all. You do not want to be the lightning rod up there. And then also, there's other things such as electricity and lightning. Lightning also likes electricity, so keep that in mind. And that kind of moves into our work area hazard survey. So, potholes, unstable soil is another big one. Holes, ditches, drop-offs, obstructions, debris, overhead obstructions, power lines, presence of unauthorized persons. These are all things you need to check before you go to operate these things. There was an instance, I was actually teaching this class a couple months ago, and there was a gentleman that was on a location. I think he was doing some electrical work, and a hotshot company had a 350 and a flatbed trailer with a man lift on it. You know, your typical articulating kind of bigger JLG. Brings it out, gets on the back of his truck, unchains it, gets in the man lift, gets in the basket, and he's going to back it off the trailer. Well, he had his basket up high so he could see well, right? He wanted to kind of see where he was going. Smart. Well, somewhat, I mean, makes sense. You want to see where you're going. That's not a terrible thing. But as he comes at the end of the trailer and starts backing off, he backed it off straight, but there was a drop. So tires came off the ramp, hit the ground, was enough force to really, an angle I'm assuming, to really give the hydraulics in that basket quite a push. So his basket sunk and then sprung, and he sprung with it. He was not tied in the basket. He flies out of the basket. I think he did survive, but I think it was a situation where you kind of wished you wouldn't have. Like, a lot of stuff broken, in the hospital for 6 to 8 months, like, you know, life-changing, altering injury. You want to know what you're doing around these things and what they can do before you're operating them. And you also always want to be tied off inside them. But what you're doing with that equipment in the work area around you is going to be the greatest hazard with this equipment. A lot of people are concerned about the equipment itself failing. I have yet to be in a situation where the equipment failing was the reason for the accident, right? They're like, oh, if I'm up this high, what if something fails and I drop? Like, that could possibly happen, especially if it's not maintained. But I've never seen that. What I've seen in all my white papers and stories I've read, fortunately I haven't been to too many incidents with these, is people operating them in unsafe conditions, near power lines, driving too fast, you know, with the basket elevated, and they hit something, a bump, and they're not tied in, and then they fall out of it. Those are the instances on unlevel ground, and it tips over. Those are the things that happen. So don't be afraid of the equipment. Again, if you're afraid of heights, but what you should be concerned about is the work area. If you know you're going to be driving around from point A to point B to point C to point D all day, do a walk through that area first. Look for power lines. Look for unstable earth. Look for potentially, you know, earth that's been washed away and that is unstable, and you're going to potentially tip that thing over when you're driving. You want to do that walk around before you go to work. All right, so moving on. Protection from falling objects, obviously people below you, and if you're working at heights, if there's things above you, this is something you want to keep in mind. Definitely don't let guys, I mean, it's, okay, don't let is probably not the right terminology, but talk to the guys you're working around and inform them not to walk under the area lift because it's a possibility you'll drop something. It's not a bad practice to wrap your cords and have tie-offs and anchorage and things like that. But, you know, screwdrivers. A screwdriver falling from 50 feet is a missile, and it can mess you up. So just keep that in mind. You know, don't let people walk underneath you because you're a suspended load, essentially, when you're up there. Moving area lifts. While driving it, you want to make sure that you avoid any surface that affects vehicle stability. Maintain a safe distance from obstacles and especially overhead lines. You want guys on tag lines with the equipment, which we'll get into on the rigging side if you're lifting things. Limit speed to a rate that is safe for the conditions of the surface. And again, like I said before, low and slow. That's just the best rule of thumb. You know, when you're driving this thing, don't be driving it when you're 25 feet in the air. There is no reason for that. I mean, I'm not saying you can't move it, but what you want to do is you want to, you know, kind of angle it at the right angle first, so where you can articulate it or tilt the basket or whatever you have to do to get to where you're going. If your tires are not in the right spot and you need to move, get down to the equipment, move it, and then boom yourself back up. Don't do that from the air. It's a terrible idea. And don't have someone do it from the ground while you're in the air. Also a terrible idea. You want to be in control of that thing. Working requirements. So you got to stay on the floor. You can't, you know, step up on the handrail. You can't jump out of the thing. You don't want to, as in our first photos, step over to something. You want to stay in that thing at all times. You can't be standing on a box, nothing, on the floor. You want to make sure that you're tied in. Sometimes they can be a little goofy, like the anchor point, so make sure you're attaching to the anchor point and not to the handrail or the guardrail. That is not the anchor point. You want to make sure that it's a good harness. It allows you the ability to move. You're not sucked up too tight to where you can't work. Obviously, that will kind of incentivize you to disconnect from your anchorage. Guardrails must be installed and never exceed the load capacity of the aerial lift. This can be tough. I mean, most lifts are designed to be able to carry 2 people, but some of them are only designed to carry like 300 pounds. So I know a couple ones around here, they're 150 pound lifts, or 350 pound lifts. It's like, well, there's no 2 people standing around here that can both get on that lift right now, right? We don't have 250 pound guys just around, so it's a 1-person lift is essentially what it is. Working requirements. The parking brake must be set while the boom's elevated. Keep that in mind. Now, a lot of them auto do that, right? Like once you stop and you start moving the boom, the parking brake on the wheels automatically sets. If you're on an incline, just like a forklift, you need to use your wheel chock. And then aerial lift trucks should not be moved when the boom is elevated. Not a good idea. Don't do it. Bad practice. Terrible, terrible idea. So lastly, wrapping this thing up, kind of summarizing everything. And again, there are a lot of similarities between a forklift and aerial lift inspections and keeping the load low and slow, etc. Watching out for people around you. But wrapping up the aerial lifts here. All aerial lifts do have to be compliant with ANSI. So that's one slight difference between forklifts. Now, forklifts do also follow ANSI regulations, don't get me wrong. But man lifts really tie into ANSI regulations. So remember that ANSI term, that is going to be important. All operators must be trained and certified prior to operating an aerial lift. Frequent inspections must be performed daily prior to use, and then periodic inspections are typically going to be your annual ones, and those do need to be documented and maintained for 5 years. Workers on aerial lifts should not be performed during work on aerial lifts, rather should not be performed during lightning conditions, heavy weather, or around power lines, period. And so we want to make sure that we're checking the work area prior to going to work on our aerial lifts. And that wraps up aerial lift safety training. All right, for our last topic today, we're going to be covering basic rigging. And we call this Basic Rigging Pro, but really, truly, this is Basic Rigging Pro Lite. Again, it's not the full training. It's just the basic rigging safety that we all need to do in order to be riggers. So if you want the card, the true card, you're going to have to come in and do the hands-on training as well as the rest of the theoretical. So kind of introducing the course, we have inspection requirements, crane operations. We'll talk about documentation, and then also hand signals, which is it's going to be a little bit challenging over video, but I think we can get her done. So job site considerations is first. We need to make sure that authorized and qualified personnel are the ones that are rigging equipment, meaning you do need to have the certification. Work areas, rigging areas, and walking areas around intended lift areas we need to make sure that they're nothing's going to impede the job or potentially get run into with the equipment as we're moving it, etc. And all rigging equipment must be inspected prior to rigging it up. So selecting rigging, this needs to be done by knowledgeable and qualified people. The condition must be appropriate type, have proper identification, and that's the one issue I mostly see with rigging equipment is not, it doesn't have the tag on it, or either a tag or a label indicating its lifting capacity. They go away over time, but you still need to take that equipment out of service. And then it needs to be inspected and is certified as well. So the load limits, we need to understand the load weight, center of gravity, sling angle is important, side loading considerations if we are doing that, and also the capacity. All these things matter. Then controlling the load, making sure that we have a tag line. This is another thing that I see. My biggest gripe with lifting and rigging and crane operations is people do not use tag lines. It's the weirdest thing. They use their hand, they leave it alone entirely, but everything, if it's lifted, it needs to have a tag line on it. If it's lifted by a center point, like a crane, not a forklift. Failure possibility, we need to always kind of keep that in mind and make sure people are out of the way and where people are. That matters during lifting operations. Then also we need to factor in wind, temperature, and then ground conditions, ice, mud, or water, as well as I mentioned before, just electrical lines and things like that. Another area where people do get hurt around cranes and lifting is electricity. All right, so we're going to look at the user responsibilities. So there's 2 users. We have our riggers, and then we have our crane operators. Once the physical components of the crane stop, meaning the hook from the rigging, that's where the rigger responsibility starts. So the crane is responsible for everything up to its hook, and the rigger is responsible for everything afterwards. So the the rigger's responsibilities, essentially I like to say UFC. Just a quick reminder, if you're a rigger, just think of UFC. Utilize appropriate rigging gear suitable for overhead lifting. Follow industry standards and manufacturers' recommendations, and then conduct regular inspections and maintenance of the rigging gear. So utilize, follow, conduct, right? That's actually not a very strong acronym, I'll give you that, but it's what I came up with, so there you go. UFC. Utilize, follow, and conduct. Inspection requirements. So it's pretty important that everything gets inspected. Again, the crane operator is responsible for his crane, should be somebody who's knowledgeable and qualified, and then the rigger needs to inspect his equipment daily. So before we go ahead and lift, we want to make sure everything's inspected by the qualified personnel. So lifting operations. As far as inspection goes, that's the first part of any rigging operations. We want to make sure equipment's inspected. If we're using wire rope, a lot of things can go wrong with wire rope as far as condition go, right? They can be kinked, they can be cut, they can start to bird cage, they can corrode, the core can have problems, and then also they can get crushed. So all these are issues with wire rope. So if you're going to be using a cable or a wire rope, we want to make sure it's in good condition. So we can see all those. We see the kinking in number 1, we see the fraying in number 2, we see the bird caging in number 3, and we see the crushing in number 4. And even in black and white, right? Like you can see it very clearly that there's issues with these cables. So capacities for wire rope, as the angle increases, the capacity decreases. So just kind of keep that in mind. So essentially the smaller the angle, and this is something you're going to get in your training, is looking at your angles, looking at the wire rope capabilities, and then understanding the limitations based on the wire rope. Now, again, this depends on the type. The weight limits will increase based on the gauge of the rope, right? So if it's a bigger rope, it's going to be, this is a pretty much, as you can see, as the angle goes up every 15 degrees, you lose about 15% of your capacity for every 15 degrees. So just keep that in mind. So types of wire rope slings, these are just basically different configurations of the slings and ways to use them. And then in some cases, different entirely. The last 3 are different types of, you have a 2, a 3, or a 4 hook unit, and then you have different ways of essentially applying that rigging for the first 8 or 10 there. All right, so we already looked at bird caging. We looked at crushing or a kink. That's what that would look like. Then we have synthetic slings. I mean, most of our industry, let's be honest, has moved to these. If they break, they tear. They don't snap and whip around and hit people. So that's a good thing. Same thing with tow chains versus tow ropes or tow slings. I mean, they're just not that they can't fail, or maybe they even fail more often. But when they fail, it's less risk to the people in the area. So we have vertical hitches. We have choker hitches, and then there's typically, you can use bars in here as well. I mean, there's different types of use cases for different types of rigging equipment, especially with slings. So sling capacity does vary. Usually they'll have different colors for different capacities, so you can easily identify, that's 500 pound or a 5,000 pound or a 10,000 pound sling based on color. User must look at the sling capacity and inspect it prior to use. If the tag is not readable or missing, you can't use it. Same thing with your wire cables. Inspect slings before each day's use and often is necessary during the day. And lastly, when you're using them, beware of sharp edges because they can cut slings. And some slings kind of have a protective, cloth on the outside, but even that protective cloth does have some rated capacity within it. So once it's compromised, it still needs to go. Chain slings, there's a lot of regulations for chain slings as far as what you need, but plain and simple, for this course, just make sure the capacity tag's attached to it, and again, it's not damaged. There's no bent or kinks or out of round linkages, that they're in good shape. So here's some examples of chain slings. So again, just like your wire rope, you're going to have different ones, and they're going to have different uses. And again, the course is going to kind of walk you through each different type and when is the best application for each different type. So to prevent slipping, you may need to add different padding, blocks, softeners, etc., so that the rigging equipment doesn't slip. And that's something that again, when you go through the course, you'll kind of get a better handle on. So lifting operations, when we go to lift, so we've inspected everything, we're making sure it's not slipping, now we're going to lift. So the basic operations, this is covered by ANSI as well, B30.9. Each day before use, everything needs to be inspected. And during operations as well, we just need to keep an eye on everything, make sure it's working. So the replacement criteria are pretty clear in ANSI B30.9. OSHA kind of tells us like, hey, inspect your sling, replace as necessary. ANSI B30.9 gives us very clear criteria of when we need to replace that equipment. So just kind of keep that in mind. That does exist, and it's very similar to chains. If it's torn, if it's ripped, if it's crushed, which doesn't happen as often with slings, fortunately. Usually, you're going to see abrasion where it's rubbed against something or it started to tear because it's been over its capacity, or it's just been stored improperly. Weather conditions will break it down over time. Water can break it down. Chemicals can break it down, etc. So safety factors to guard against failure of wire rope in service. The actual load on the rope should only be a fraction of the breaking strength. This is something else. Like if it says 5,000 and we're like, oh, it's 4,999 pounds, we're good. Well, yes, you will be good, but why not use a 10,000 pound or a 6,000 pound or something that's heavier so that we're not essentially pushing it to its breaking point, right? We want to make sure that we are, above and beyond, not right at the number, because they're just going to fail sooner. I mean, they're going to start to get weakened, and you're going to start to see bird caging and things like that. So do not overload the crane or hoist. Make sure the combined weight of the lifter and load does not exceed the rated load. And again, I'm a big fan. Now it's difficult. It's more difficult with overhead cranes, right? It's not like, oh, let's get a heavier crane in here, right? It's installed. It's there. So I do recognize it's easier said than done, but that's my recommendation, is make sure you're well below the lifting capacity or the weight capacity of the actual crane. We don't want multiple people giving hand signals. That's extremely important. I've seen this time and time again where people want to help, right? So they're talking to the crane operator, telling them what to do, or relaying the hand signal from the guy that's down in the hole or wherever he's at. And if you have multiple people doing that, it causes problems. We don't want people to ride equipment. That's kind of a no-no. You can use a tagline, but we don't want people riding the loads. So to pick up a load, we want to direct the crane and hoist hook directly above the load to eliminate the possibility of side loading and minimize load swing. So this is another area where I've personally seen a lot of incidents and injuries, is where people are standing in a bad position where essentially once that load's lifted, it does swing and they can't get out. Like they're blocked into a corner, or there's something right behind them where their back's to something. So keep that in mind. Make sure that the possibility of side swing once it's lifted is minimized, and then make sure you're well out of the area if that were to happen. Some of the things about operational safety before lifting: ensure that everyone's clear of any pinch points or crush zones. And then when starting to lift the load, only lift it a few inches off the ground at first. So if you're the guy giving the hand signals, you're not like wide swinging your arm to lift up. You want to give them a pinch lift, right? So they just barely lift it. Make sure it's stable before you just, really start going into second gear there, lifting stuff up and moving it around. So make sure the rigging is in good condition, which we've kind of already covered, and make sure it's appropriate for the weight, load size, and shape, again, for what it is that you're lifting, so it's stable. Always maintain a clear view of the crane path, that there's nothing blocking you. Move that stuff out of the way if you can. Now, there are times where you're going to be moving it to an area where you're moving it over something, for example, and that crane path isn't clear. So you want to make sure that your spotters are in a good place where they can see where everything's going and see the crane operator. You can use multiple spotters. That can get complicated, but it's better to have multiple spotters where everything is visible rather than having blind spots. So, we call these suspended loads once the lift is engaged. So once you have tension on the lift line, we have a suspended load at that point. No part of a person should be underneath a load. Not a finger underneath a load. Not a finger, not a foot, not a head, not an arm, nothing. If you have a tag line, you want to keep that thing taut, and you want to make sure that you have significant distance, that as much as is physically possible, and maintain safety away from that load. So if you're traveling, you want to make sure you're focused on that, not looking at your phone, not listening to your tunes, not, hanging out, talking to Billy. Your job is to safely engage that load, secure that load, and support that load till it reaches its final destination. And then, pump up your DMX once you get over there. Never leave a suspended load unattended. We don't want to lift it and be like, lunchtime, leave it hanging in the air and go. That's a no-no. We want to make sure that while a load's engaged, that there's someone always in the equipment and that they always have a signal person available for that crane. So when moving the load, I already kind of talked about this. We want to make sure that we stay clear. I don't, for me, it should never be a situation where like 5-foot tag lines, to me, that's no. Like, obviously the tag line has to meet the industry standard, and you don't want 100 feet of tag line behind you. I can get that. But you also don't want to be like barely holding on to this thing, looking like a little kid holding his dad's hand walking down the street. You want to give yourself a little bit of distance so you have control without it potentially, yanking you underneath the load. So, if you're walking with the thing, you want to have enough distance so that you have some play and you can step around things and have a little bit of rope. So just make sure your tag lines are long enough. All right, so with that, we're going to move in kind of the end here into hand signals. So again, this is a little bit difficult to do over video here, but I think we can get her done. So standard hand signals. So load lower is an elbow out and hand down. Right hand, left hand really depends on what hand you are. Either way, the signal's the same. It's an elbow out, hand pointed down, and a circular motion with your finger. Hoist load is the opposite, elbow out, hand up with a circular motion with your finger. Slowly, you can have a tap method or a pinch where you pinch and then do it, or you can put your hand over it, which shows just inch it, right? And then same thing, elbow out pointed up, elbow out pointed down, with your top hand across, and then give it the pinch signal or the cap signal, and again rotating that finger. Bridge travel left, if you're using a bridge, or even if you're swinging the crane, that's going to be arm across, and then with the hand, the other elbow bent with the hand up in the direction that you want them to travel. So to the left, your left hand's going to be up. To the right, your right hand's going to be up. Trolley level, if you're using a trolley again, that's going to be a thumb out, or a thumb, basically elbow bent, thumb out towards the left or right, and that's going to tell them which way to take the trolleys. If you have multiple trolleys, you're going to indicate that and essentially say, again, you're going to have two. I would do one at a time, but if you're going to move them together, then have your two with your thumb pointed out. All right, and our final hand signal and slide for the day is stop. So stop this safety training right now. No, I'm just kidding. So stop is an arm parallel to the ground, hand parallel to the ground, moving across the body, and you want to make this extremely clear as you're moving into cross. As a signal person, you always want to maintain clear visual with the crane operator. It's a good idea to have a vest on. Most of the time that's required. You want to make sure that you have, again, maintain that clear. There's nothing in your way, no obstructions. And as a signal person, you want to make sure as you're moving, you're not going to be tripping over something if you have to move to maintain that eye contact as you're continuing to give hand signals. Lastly, again, make sure you're the only person giving hand signals unless you've established a clear chain around, an obstruction or something like that. There should be one designated signal person at all times. Well, with that, thank you very much for tuning in this month. Everybody, hope you have a great, safe month as these temperatures cool down. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. Everybody, enjoy the rest of summer here and our warm days, and let's keep this safety going.